Okay, this video will be an intro on requests. Request is a Python-based HTTP library. And what we're going to be covering in this intro video is pulling data. So we'll be pulling a list of countries from an HTML page, also a JSON API. And the same API is also available in XML. So we'll just go through 3 examples on how to pull data from each of those. So in this first example, we have basically a table. This is all HTML. If we do inspect, we can see we have a table with an ID of rank order. And then if we come down here, we also have table rows and then table columns. So this one is Liechtenstein. And then if we want the ISO code, the 2-digit ISO code, that would be this LS here. So we would have to parse that out. So Python makes this pretty easy. So if we return to the editor, so the first thing we would have to do is import requests. So if you do not have that installed already, we have to do pip install requests. I already have that installed. Otherwise, pip would install it. So let's go ahead and import requests. And so we need the URL. Let's just copy and paste that. Now fetching the data or just getting the raw HTML, that is very easy. We just need to set up a variable for it, response. And we want to call request the get method. This will actually send an HTTP GET request to the URL that we just set the variable up for. And so what we need to do is get the HTML response. So we need response.text. So we call this text property. What the response object is basically a response object within requests. So at this point, what we have is a raw HTML. So if we were to print this, and then if I save that and run it, as we can see, we got all the entire HTML source code of that web page. So at this point, what we would need to be able to parse data from this is we would need something a little bit extra. We would need something like Beautiful Soup. I'm just going to go ahead and install Beautiful Soup. And the latest version is version 4, so we need BS4, and that's going to get us the Beautiful Soup package. So up here from BS4, so that's the Beautiful Soup object. And I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. And I'm going to set up a new variable. We'll call this soup. And what we need to do is pass in our HTML. The second argument, we need to pass in what type of parser it is. So this is an HTML parser. And also, let's just narrow this down to the table since the table has its own ID. So we'll call the find method, and then the ID equals, if you recall from that, from seeing the source code, it's called rank order. And that's a capital O actually. And we can narrow this further. We can just drill down into the table rows. So we'll set up a variable for that. So now that we have all the table rows in a list, we can just loop through them. So for row in rows. And so if you recall from this, what we will need is the actual column. So we need all these columns here with the class of region. So let's go ahead and grab those. So we want all TD elements, which are the table columns, within the individual row. And then we want a class of region. So there's multiple columns here. So these other ones we're not interested in. We're just trying to grab a list of countries. So we want the country name and then the ISO code. So we could put an if statement, make sure that the target column actually exists, that it's not none. And let's go ahead and grab the link. That's going to be target column So if we call the find all method, since we're using beautiful soup, find all is always going to return a list. So yes, it's a list of 1, so we need to pass in the index value of 0 to get the first item. So we want to find the anchor tag, and then the href. So the href, what that's going to give us is this whole thing right here. So /geos/ls.html. Since we just want the ISO code, we're going to parse. So we're going to find the index of .html and then work backwards. So let's set up a variable for that. So we'll call this idx.html. And then now we can get the country code. So from the href variable, which is the full link, so we want index. Our start is going to be index or idx. We want to subtract 2 because it's a 2-character ISO code. To index HTML. So if we start with this dot, go back 2 places, that'll give us our ISO code. And so for now, so I hit the caps lock on accident. So we print, let's say country code. Okay, so if I typed everything in correctly, we should just get a bunch of ISO codes for each country. And which we did, so it looped through all the countries, pulled out all of the different ISO codes. So that's an approach that if you're going to be scraping HTML content, using requests in conjunction with beautiful soup is probably the most common way to do this. But what's usually better is if we can parse data from an API, because the API is already going to have data that's a lot better structured and we have to do a lot less work to parse the results. So I'm going to go ahead and clear everything except for requests. And let's go ahead and go over to our JSON API. Now, both of these are exactly the same. The URL is the same, except on this one, we're asking for JSON. By default, it's going to give us XML. Usually JSON is the best alternative. So if JSON is available, I use that first. If not, one of the other items like XML, and then HTML for me is usually a last resort. If I try not to scrape HTML data because the structure of the HTML pages can change. And APIs seem to be a lot more reliable and they're just more consistent and change a lot less frequently. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL. So let's go ahead and set up our variable, and that is our endpoint. And so similar to the first, we're just going to set up a response variable, and we want to call request.get. So sending a GET request to the URL. Now what's really nice about request is that there is a built-in JSON decoder. So all we need to do to basically convert this into data that we could actually use is call response.json. So I'm going to set up a variable, call it country data. So now all we need to do, if we actually, before we get into that, we notice what we have is an array. So a JSON array. The first item in the array is a a object with metadata that gives us, so this is paginated. We're only getting the first 50 results here. So we can see that page 1 out of 7 pages per page is 50 out of 304 total. And then we have this other array that actually has the data that we want. So we have an array with 2 items in it, the second one being an array with all the countries. So what we need to do for this is loop through the second item in the array. So we'll set this up as for country and this country data, and then we need to pass in a 1. So by passing in a 1, that's going to skip all of that metadata and then go right to the list of countries. Actually, probably be easier just to say countries equals country data 1, and now we can just loop through so countries is going to be its own list. And we can just print this out. We got country.name. So if we just look at this once again, so here we have Aruba, and then we have the ISO 2 code. So let's copy that. And if we just save the file and run it. And yeah, so we're able to pull the JSON API data and then print the countries along with the ISO codes. It looks like what they have mixed in there is basically region data. So if we wanted, we can parse those out. But yeah, that is the gist of pulling JSON data. So requests, it does a great job not only in fetching the HTTP content, but having the built-in JSON decoder is very handy. So we don't need to import the JSON library and try and convert it and parse it ourselves. We can just let requests handle that for us. Okay, so the last example for as far as pulling data is concerned, we're going to pull the same API. Now this is XML format, so we have a WB : countries, and then the individual countries are nested inside of that, and all these attributes here give us our metadata. So let's go ahead and return to this, and I'm going to go ahead and just delete everything else. And let's copy our URL. The URL is the same except for we're not passing in any options, so it's going to give us XML by default. So the first step is going to be the same as the others. So request.get, send a GET request. And then we'll just call this country data again. So we're going to start with just the text value. So at this point, we need some way of parsing the information. We could use Beautiful Soup for this again and just pass in a different parser instead of the HTML parser. We would pass in, I think there's a couple different XML parsers, but we can also use the built-in XML library that comes with Python as part of the standard library. So let's go ahead and do that. So for this, we want to import xml.etree.elementtree, and then we'll call it ET. That way we don't have to type it out every single time. So now let's set up a new variable for countries for our list. So we want et.fromString. Since we're pulling it from an API and not a file that's already on our local file system, we want to use the fromString method. And then let's pass in our country data. And let's just go ahead and see what this gives us. We'll just print the countries. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so what we have is a single element. So what that is basically this entire element with everything else wrapped inside of it. So what we need to do from here, so we can still loop through the countries. We have to call the findAll method. However, there is one issue. So if you look at this closely, there's a namespace. So namespace WB, and then if we follow the attributes value, it's just this worldbank.org URL. However, in order for the parsing to work, we have to declare the namespace inside of our code. So we need to set up a variable like this. So let's set up a new namespaces variable. And we'll say WB. And let's just copy this value. Now we can go ahead and loop through the countries. So we're going to call findAll. And what we need is WB:country. And then we need to pass in our namespaces. And we already set that variable up. And since we're using this as a selector, we have to have this declared out here, otherwise it won't be able to parse it. So the first thing we want is the name. So inside of the country element, we basically want the name. There's a name attribute. There is also an ISO2 code. So we're going to go ahead and grab both of those. So we call find instead of find all because find all would have given us an array and we'd have to pass the index of 0. So let's just use the find method. And if you notice, this also has the WB namespaces in every single one of the nested elements. So we need to pass that in again as well. And .text. So I'm going to go ahead and copy, then change this to the ISO code. And then we'll just go ahead and print that out. And save it and run. And it looks like we got an attribute error. Let me take a look. I think I spelled that wrong. I think we need a capital C, and I have a lowercase. So we go ahead and fix that and then try it again. Okay, and then just like before, we got a similar result as if we did the JSON API. We got the countries. We also got those areas or regions. I don't know what they actually call them, but so using requests, it makes it very easy. So if you're using XML and, for legacy websites, XML APIs, there's still quite a few of them out there. So it's good to be familiar with them. JSON is probably the best and easiest way to consume data. It's not always available, unfortunately, but in this, what we covered were 3 different ways to use requests to pull data. So in this intro video, there are a couple of other things I wanted to cover. One of them is checking for status codes. Another one is checking for redirects. So checking for status codes is very easy. I'm just going to set up a new URL. Let's just use a site everybody's familiar with, github.com. So to get the status code, we just need r.statuscode. At response.statuscode. So let's go ahead and run that. And then we get a value of 200, which means it's a successful request. And so the status code, that's an important thing to check. Like say you're pulling data from many different APIs, and then on each one, maybe you have some sort of logging setup. You can always check the status code of all of your requests. And then if you're missing data or whatever, you can always go back and look at the logs and see what happened with your script or your bot or your cron job not being able to pull the data in properly. Now, there is one thing to be aware of with this. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to HTTP. And if you take a look at this, we're going to get the exact same result back, but there are a couple of extra things that happened. So let's load this in the browser and take a look. Now what I'm going to do is put this in. I'm going to open up Developer Tools. And I'm going to go into the Network tab here and hit Preserve Log. And I'm going to go with all requests. I had AJAX only. Actually, I'm going to go with Document here. Let's try that first. So notice that we got redirected to HTTPS. And you notice that we were actually redirected. So we've originally fetched HTTP github.com and then HTTPS. So what happened here is it looks like it just made one single request and we just got a single 200 response back. So we did go through the redirect. So the way we can check for that is response.history. And then if we were to rerun this, notice that we have a list here of responses. So we had one redirect and then we got the 200 response. So if you're pulling data from somewhere and you get redirected, unless you're looking for this, you're probably not going to know. But if this is an important issue, what you could pass in the allow redirects option. And we can set that to false. So if we were to rerun this, so we got back a 301 response and then an empty list of history because we did not allow any of the redirects, so it stopped after the first HTTP request. So we got our status code and our history. If there's no redirects and if it's just a normal fetch, that list is going to be blank, it's just going to be empty. So this has been an introduction on using the request library to pull information from the web. Thank you for watching.